Okay, let's start. Then, welcome to the Industrial Engineering and Operational Research Seminar. This time it's a great pleasure to have Garud Iyengar. Garud is the chair of the Industrial Engineering and Operational Research Department at Columbia University. He holds a BS in Industrial Engineering, and in his PhD was in Stanford, and he works in a bunch of different things in industrial engineering, particular things with risk, and also other things with modeling complex problems and decomposition algorithms. So thank you very much, Garud, for being here, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Rodrigo. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure. My first time in Chile. I'm really enjoying myself. Rodrigo has been asking me to come over for many years now. I have to come back for New Year's Eve because I'm told that that's the thing to do, go to Valparaiso. And so today I'm going to be talking about a series of work that I've done with different sets of collaborators. And the theme that's going to connect this pieces of work is our attempt at understanding something called systemic risk. In the first few slides, I'll try to motivate what systemic risk is. Much of this work was actually motivated by financial systemic risk, although you will see as we go along that the techniques don't have to be restricted to financial systemic risk in any way. So let me start with a story which had to do right after the financial crisis in 2008. Bad things were happening. Companies were going bankrupt. The thing that initiated this bankruptcy were driven really by the mortgage crisis. And I'll come to another quote from there. But around the same time, various companies were going down. And this was an interesting quote from that period that we started thinking about what was going on. Ford, which was doing well, went to Capitol Hill in 2008 to push for the rescue of its rivals, General Motors and Chrysler. It went to the Congress and said that these two companies should actually be bailed out. General Motors received $49.5 billion. Chrysler Group received $10.5 billion in bailout funds. Ford got nothing because it was doing well. And one of the questions that we started thinking about is why would this company, which is clearly a competitor of GM and Chrysler, want those companies to exist? And what story turned out was without financing during bankruptcy, GM and Chrysler would have had to go out of business. And the important thing that would happen is taking down many suppliers. That would likely cause bankruptcies at the healthier automakers such as Ford Motor, who would not have been able to get the parts they needed to build their cars. Okay, you're good. I thought maybe you're objecting to this quote. So the story, many things are happening here, but one of the things that you should keep in mind in terms of, particularly in industrial engineering kind of setting, there's a supply chain that supplies to these cars. Cars are not something that just happen all of a sudden. There are all these companies that give different parts. Many of the same companies produce parts for, the companies that are producing parts for GM and Chrysler also produce parts for Ford. And as a result, if GM and Chrysler go down, the profitability of these companies goes down, which means that Ford can no longer rely on having these companies available for making parts. And it was the interconnection between these companies. So if you just look at the level of Ford, GM, and Chrysler, you think of these companies competing. But if you go one step below and start seeing who are the people supplying these companies, there is hidden interdependencies that need to be understood in order to understand what's going to happen. Okay. So what I want to do in this talk is talk about this notion of systemic risk, which is risk associated with a collection of entities, collection of interdependent entities. It could be firms in an economy. That was the example of these three companies. It could be business units within a company, suppliers, subcontractors in a supply chain context, generating stations, transmission facilities in a power network, particularly if those things have already been sort of decoupled. Sometimes they're all a monopoly, but sometimes they're decoupled. And there are incentives or let's say that actions that are taken by one of these entities could have very bad effects on some of the other entities. And we want to understand how those actions could impact various things. I'm not saying that by the end of this talk I'll be able to answer questions, but this is the motivation that I want to go towards. Systemic risk refers to the risk of the entire system, not individual entities. We're not talking about a particular company failing or a particular supplier not being able to supply what it contracted for. We're not interested in a particular firm, in a financial firm failing, but rather of the entire system failing. And in order to understand, in order to make sense out of this systemic risk, one has to do a simultaneous analysis of outcomes across the entities in the system. And furthermore, there are possibilities of complex interactions across this network. And this is what we wanted to capture, or what we want to capture in our story. Here's another sort of example of how networks start playing a role, and how, in order to understand systemic risk, you have to think about networks in different ways. This also was motivated around the financial crisis, and this is a story that's been going on for a long time now. It's not clearly understood, not fully understood anyway, whether the financial crisis, this kind of network mattered or that kind of network. So let me give you a little bit of story here. The blue dots here stand for firms, and these are financial firms. The red dot stands for assets. In this particular network, different firms owe money to each other. So there are different kinds of bidirectional. So this company owes only money to that one, but this one doesn't owe money to that one. Here there's a bidirectional edge. And one of the stories that was being told about the financial crisis was that this was the kind of network that was underlying the financial firms. Lehman Brothers went down. It was owing money to a lot of other firms. And because now it doesn't give back the money, some of the obligations that these firms had to other firms will have to come down, and so on. And now you get a domino effect. But soon after, so this was what the story was in the 2008. By 2012-ish, the story had morphed, that it was not this network that mattered, but that network. The reason these companies came down was not because they were owing money to each other, but because of the fact that they were all exposed to the same asset class, which was subprime mortgages. And because people didn't know what the value of these subprime mortgages were, they all started getting affected. And one of the things I want you to think about, and this will come up later on in the talk as well, is think about the following situation. Let's say that this particular, I want to find a firm that is not exposed to this one. Right, these two, perfect. So let's say that this guy over here is subprime mortgages. So this is an asset that's really bad. These two companies are exposed to those assets, whereas this company is not exposed to that asset and that company is not exposed to that asset. Now, in a contagion like or a systemic risk kind of situation, what might happen is that the value of this bad asset goes down. Typically, financial firms are leveraged, meaning that they invest more than they actually own by borrowing money from their creditors. When the value of this asset goes down, these companies are basically being told, look, I want my money back. I don't trust how much value you have. So what are these companies going to do? This asset is not working anyway. So this particular company only holds either that asset or this relatively good asset. So it's going to start selling this relatively good asset. And its value is going to come down because it's in a fire sale like situation. This particular asset is going to be sold immediately in the market. People won't know why it's being sold, because they won't know that it's being sold because that asset has gone bad. They will just see that things are being sold. As a result, these two companies, which had actually done the right thing of not investing in the bad asset, suddenly they find themselves into trouble because this asset's value has gone down. As a result, their valuation has come down. And so there is another way that things could transmit from this firm or these two firms to those two firms, not because they're directly connected, but because they're connected through the assets that they hold. And here's a quote, which by 2012, this is about 4 years after the financial crisis, people were starting to feel that that's not the right model, but that is the right model. None of these firms are weakened by its exposure to Lehman, which is this model, saying Lehman went down and brought down the entire financial system, or anyone else. They were weakened by the fact that virtually all of them held or were suspected of holding, which is perhaps even more important, large amounts of what the media came to call toxic assets. And what was interesting was that the Federal Reserve came in and bought all of these toxic assets and ended up actually making money on them because they really weren't toxic, but people felt that they were toxic. The story wasn't of underlying values being bad. The story was at that panic situation, nobody wanted to hold anything. Right? Okay. So those are the kind of stories that I want to understand. I want to understand, how does risk propagate in the network? How can I put a measure on it? So if I give you a network and say, how risky is this? What can I do? Is there a notion in which I can define riskiness? Or if I look at that network, can I tell you what are the pathways that are likely to transmit risk? These are the type of questions that I want to ask in this research agenda. And we took 3 different pathways, or I'm going to talk about 3 different research ideas that we explored. The first one, we took what is called the risk management approach. In the risk management approach, the story is that you know the portfolios of the companies already. They're not going to change. This is what a regulator would do. A regulator would go into a company and say, show me your books, show me what you're holding, and I'm going to stress test you. I'm going to say in different scenarios what could potentially happen to your portfolio, and I want to understand what is the risk there. And what I want to do is that once those risks have manifested, I want to be able to apportion that risk to the different entities. I want to say, Goldman Sachs, you are responsible for the majority of the risk, and you have to pay a certain amount of tax or a certain amount of money into the regulator so that that money could later be used to understand. When the system actually goes back, I'm going to go and use that money to bail things out. Here, portfolios are known. So the next one that I'm going to do is talk about some stylized dynamic models where portfolios updates are going to be known. People are going to update that portfolio, but the rules themselves are going to be known. And I want to understand what happens here. So we want to understand what are some characteristics of resilient networks. What kind of networks are more resilient, under what scenarios, and so on. And finally, we're going to look at particular networks. So here we're going to look at some idea called sign digraphs, which have been used in process control a lot. And we want to use these models to analyze particular networks. We sort of are going from fairly general to more particular. And what ends up happening is here we can essentially tell you more mathematical answers, whereas as we go down this route, we can start talking about a much more concrete engineering-like solution. All right. Now for the math, I'll start with the sort of the more theoretical understanding. We're going to denote by script F the set of nodes in the network. This could be suppliers, firms, edges in a graph, and so on. At a particular node I, x tilde I would refer to the random loss at node I. X tilde F would refer to the random loss of the network. So this is simply a vector of all these i's stacked up together. Okay. The goal of this exercise, of this risk management exercise, is to design a measure for the acceptability of this vector. What is the risk of that vector? I want to design a risk measure such that when I take that measure and apply it to this vector of random variables, I get a number. It's a mapping from a vector of random variables to a real number, and I want to call this the risk associated with this random variable. And then what I want to do is I want to take this number and allocate it to individual entities. I want to be able to say that of this total risk that is there of the economy, 50% belongs to entity 1, 25% to entity 2, and so on. And I want to allocate them in a way that's incentive compatible. What is the incentive compatibility here? I'm pretending I'm the regulator. All these companies have declared to me what their portfolios are. I am measuring the risk, and I'm going to go and tell to one of the companies, you're 50%, you're 25%, or whatever. What I don't want to happen is for these companies to turn around and tell me, you know what, I don't want you as a regulator. I'm going to go away and form my own little group, and I'm going to do my own risk management. I'm not going to come to you. So what I want is this kind of breakaways doesn't happen. I want to give an allocation such that it's not in their incentive to break away from the group, the risk, because implicitly I'm assuming that having a larger group of companies together allows me more diversification capabilities and as a result, reduce the risk. But on the other hand, if I inequitably assign this risk to a particular entity, they might just want to get out. So that's the incentive compatibility that I'm after. All right, so I'll give you some examples and then I'll go back and see what happened. So this research was actually started sort of backwards. Around this time, this is again 2008, 2009, a lot of different risk measures were being proposed for the economy because systemic risk of the financial system was starting to become very important. These are two classic things that were proposed. So what happens over here? So F is the firms in the economy, Xi omega is the loss of firm I in scenario omega. So what I've done is I've gone from random variables to scenarios now. So this particular risk measure that was proposed by Viral Acharya and Brownlees and a bunch of other people together was to do the following. In every scenario omega, collect up all the risk that you could possibly get or all the losses that you could possibly get. So sum over I in the set of firms Xi omega. So this summation refers to the total loss in scenario omega. Now it's simply one random variable. Look at the conditional value at risk of that particular random variable at some level alpha and call that the risk of the economy. There's a problem with this because consider a scenario where for one of the firms I, Xi omega is negative. So in that particular scenario, this particular firm made a profit and another firm actually made a loss. It's possible that this summation turns out to be 0, which means that the profit-making firm subsidized the loss-making firm in bringing the overall loss down to 0. So, which in a very cooperative economy, perhaps this is valid, but in an economy where these firms are completely separate entities, they don't want to go and subsidize each other. Okay? But if these Xi's omegas are actually losses within a division of a company, then perhaps this is a sensible measure. Different divisions could cross-subsidize, and this makes sense. All right? So this was something that was pointed out as being bad. And so another risk measure was proposed, which was to take the sum over I and F, the same thing, but now it's the sum of Xi omega with a positive part. So if it's so this positive part operator, whenever this quantity here is negative, we'll just set it to 0. So no cross-subsidization happens anywhere in this particular one. And instead of using a conditional value at risk, they want to use a risk-neutral expectation. Why? Because now this has the interpretation of deposit insurance. How much money do you have to keep away today if you want to insure against things happening in the future? These were two different measures that were proposed around 2009, 2010. As we know with our various publication speeds, even if it was done in 2008, it probably shows up in 2011 that somebody actually publishes it. Anyway, so this was what was done. And what we were sort of thinking, what started getting us thinking about this particular research project is, why is this structure done? And what do I mean by why is this structure? What I mean is that it seems to be the case that what you do is you aggregate across firms for a particular scenario, and then you put a risk measure associated with just scenarios on top of it. That's the aggregation that's going on, and CVAR now is a risk measure across scenarios. Similarly over here, you're aggregating over firms, but not just the linear function, but a convex function. And then again, you're putting a risk measure, in this case, expectation, over scenarios. Is this generic? That is, if you take any kind of risk measure, what are the axioms under which you're going to say that you're going to have risk measures like this? It sort of decomposes in these two dimensions. So part of our understanding was, let's try to understand, put some axioms such that these kinds of structures can be explained. And if we are able to explain them, the axioms would also tell us what kind of assumptions are we making underneath it. So I'm going to give you the axioms. I'm going to tell you as I go along, I'll also tell you things that are wrong with it. And that way you can basically say that these guys also have the same problems. I'm going to give you the construction in the simplest possible setting. And then later on, I'll tell you some extensions that other research groups have made to cover scenarios that we did not. I'm going to have a finite number of firms and finite number of scenarios. So as far as my economy is concerned, it's a matrix. This matrix tells me everything that is going to happen in my economy, everything that's going to happen to all the firms and in every state of the world. So a risk measure now will be a mapping from this matrix to a real number. And I want to understand certain properties of these matrices. What do you want to put on top of them? Here's an example, three firms, three future scenarios. So this is the matrix that I'm concerned about. A loss matrix, positive is a loss, negative is a profit. In scenario 1, firm 1 has a big loss, firm 2 has a big profit, and firm 3 has a medium loss. Right? So what I want to do is put some axioms so that I can quantify what is the total risk of this matrix and how does one allocate this risk to each of the three firms. Just stare at it, because at the end of the little exercise here, I'm going to come back to this matrix. If you look at this matrix, it looks as if it's symmetrical, but it's not. One firm has higher loss. I'll show again when it comes down, and we'll try to allocate losses to that one. But just if you get a feel for it, you should sort of start seeing what's going to happen there. All right. Here are my axioms. I'm going to assume that this matrix, this mapping that goes from omega cross F, this matrix to R, must satisfy monotonicity. I have two economies, X and Y. In every scenario for every firm, the loss in economy X is greater than the loss in economy Y. Then I better have the situation where the rho, the mapping, actually puts a higher risk level to X as compared to Y. Non-controversial, not a big deal. The other one, which is something that one has to worry about, positive homogeneity. If I take an economy and multiply by a factor alpha, which is greater than 0, then I'm going to claim that my risk measure will simply take the old risk value and multiply it by the same level alpha. This is a problem, potentially. This is something called this doesn't satisfy something called a too big to fail kind of property. As my company scales up, we want the risk not to go up linearly, but to grow non-linearly in a convex fashion. We want it to grow faster than linear. But I'm going to assume this. Later on, I'm going to show you that as far as the theory goes, one can remove this. But I want you to, for the moment, just recognize the fact that there is a problem here. But let's move on. Next one is normalization. This is just a unit measurement. I have to assign some units, whether I'm measuring this risk in Chilean pesos or US dollars. That's the kind of thing. So every time I have an economy where there's a unit loss in every scenario of the world, I'm going to give it the number script F. It could have been anything else. It's just a matter of changing definitions of the units. Now I'm going to have something more problematic. So let's try to understand what's going to happen over here. So given a risk measure rho, I can define a ordering on vectors X and Y that are outcomes for all the firms. So X and Y are not matrices. These are basically outcomes in a particular scenario. So an economy with outcome X in all states of the world, omega, will be represented by this vector X. And similarly, an economy with outcome Y in all states of the world, omega, would be represented by Y. I'm going to say that X is worse than Y, or has higher risk than Y, corresponding to my risk measure rho, if the rho assigns a larger value to the economy where everywhere the losses are X, as compared to an economy where everywhere the losses are Y. Okay? I'm going to say that if I take arbitrary vectors X, so here what I'm doing is, up until now, I was thinking of economies X and economies Y. Now I'm saying, okay, let's take outcomes. And if I take one outcome here and one outcome there, and it so happens that my ranking always says this outcome is worse than that outcome, and I stick them together as a matrix instead of I had these columns of vectors. When I put them together, my rho should be consistent. If I disliked X column to the Y column in all scenarios omega, I better dislike the matrix X as compared to the matrix Y. Yeah.
In this context, can I Understand that you're talking about individual firms, for example, because one vector could be a firm, right? And we have to a firm versus another firm.
No. These are vectors which have dimensions of firms.
Okay.
So these are things that are happening in a scenario for every firm.
Okay. For the whole economy.
For the whole economy, correct. But in a particular scenario. So what I'm saying is that here, in every scenario of the world, if economy X is worse than economy Y, then when I put the entire matrix together, it should not flip. If one economy is worse always, it better be the case that the entire thing is worse. So this is again not controversial. This is fine. Now comes another two pieces. And when I'm going through these two pieces, keep this thing in mind. I'll give you the final result and then we'll come back. So I'm going to talk about two kinds of convexities. There's one convexity where the outcome Z is alpha X plus alpha bar Y. Alpha bar will stand for 1 minus alpha. I'm going to argue, I'm going to want that my risk measure be such that the risk of Z is less than the risk of alpha times X plus alpha bar times Y. So I want you to think of the outcome convexity as basically cross subsidization. So if I'm allowing, when I take a convex combination of X and Y, the risk is lower than the convex combination of the individual risk, because it's possible that some X's are positive, some Y's are negative, and they cancel out and you end up getting the other thing. The other thing, so this is the normal convexity that you associate with various kinds of convex arguments, meaning diversification helps. The other one is actually slightly different. Here what we are doing, in all scenarios, the outcome Z omega, the risk of Z omega is being said to be alpha, the risk of X, plus alpha bar, the risk of Y. Yes, question? Okay. And here what I'm arguing is that if this is the case, then the overall risk in Z is less than the risk of alpha rho X plus alpha bar rho Y. And here what is happening, and I'm happy to talk offline a little bit more. This is a little bit more tricky story. The way I want you to think about this is that in Z, we are removing randomness. With X and Y, with probability alpha, I was getting an economy X. With probability alpha bar, I was going to get an economy Y. With Z, some things are going to happen with certainty. Whenever things happen with certainty, my risk comes down. So the other one removes randomness. So, yes?
So you always suppose that the rho of a constant rho of C is C.
Basically, what will happen is positive homogeneity and normalization will make sure of that. So here, take this one says that if it's a constant matrix, I give it an arbitrary number. And now if I take my alpha to be a constant C, then I'll end up getting from this rule that rho of C times the constant must be equal to C times rho of the constant. And therefore, I already have some number for it. So these two, positive homogeneity ends up telling you the same thing. Although later on, I'm going to criticize that even if it's a constant, maybe if that constant becomes very large, you don't want it to be, you want certain impact of that constant to come out.
So can you then this generalization of a coherent risk?
Absolutely. That's where I'm building towards. Exactly. This is a generalization of coherent risk measures, and which will come right in the next slide. Absolutely. So the way I want you to think is outcome convexity is basically when you mix things, you end up getting lower risk. Or if you take Z and split it up into, if Z is correspondingly made of two random quantities, Z has lower risk than the two random quantities separately. Okay, why did we come up with all of this story? So here's a story that ends up, I'm going to give you the theorem. We'll call an aggregation function to be a function that takes a vector of firms and gives a number that is monotonic, positively homogeneous, convex, and normalized so that the aggregation of the constant vector is script f. So aggregation function aggregates risk across firms in a given scenario. And we have a theorem which says that if a risk measure rho is a systemic risk measures with rho f equal to r, if and only if there exists an aggregation function and a coherent single firm base risk measure rho 0, such that the entire risk measure can be written in terms of this aggregation function composed with a single firm coherent risk measure. A lot of math happened here. So let me go back and tell you what I want you to show this picture. I want to go back to those two examples. Stuff inside here is aggregating the risk in a particular scenario across firms. This is what I'm calling an aggregation function now. C-var alpha is a coherent risk measure, which takes this aggregated risk. All the firms have disappeared now. There's only a risk per scenario. And now you just attach your favorite coherent risk measure on top of it, and that will give a risk measure. Here, same thing. Here's an aggregation function. The stuff in here is not quite a coherent risk measure. It's monotonic, but it's not positively homogeneous necessarily. But the aggregation function, once you slap it, on top of it, you get your coherent risk measure. In this case, it's just the expectation with respect to the risk neutral measure, and you get the answer. What the rest of my theory basically tells me is that if you like these risk measures, then implicitly you are buying into all of these 5 axioms. And if you buy into the 5 axioms, those are the only kinds of risk measures that you could generate. In particular, you are buying into positive homogeneity, and you're buying into this notion of convexities, these 2 different notions of convexities. So that was partially what we were looking for, trying to get an understanding of where can we go with this. Once we had an understanding of how to decompose a matrix risk measure into 2 one-dimensional risk measures, now we had a recipe for doing it whatever we felt like it. So here's just the same example written out. The lambda total, the risk measure, the aggregation function is just take the total. The total risk measure is apply systemic expected shortfall is C-var onto that lambda total. Here the lambda loss is just the positive part, and then you apply deposit insurance, which is basically the risk neutral expectation of the lambda loss associated with X. Now you can start doing other things. Suppose you had a resource allocation problem. A is a set of activities, F is a set of capacitated resources, Xi omega is now the shortage of resource I in scenario omega. And we want to solve a problem of this sort. The aggregation function could be Xi's are now losses, UAs are the amount by which I have to bring down the activities to make sure that my total reduction is above the loss or the shortage in resource I, and I want to do it in min cost way. If you look at this function, a little bit of duality will convince you that as a function of X, this is actually a convex function and can play the role of an aggregation function. Here, UA is the reduction in level of activity A, CA is per unit cost in reduction, BIA is the per unit consumption of resource by activity A. So once I have this aggregation function, I can put other kinds of risk measures on top of it. So if you had a network flow problem, for example, where these capacitated resources are, say, edge capacities, now I have a way of understanding how to put riskiness there. If these edges are owned by different companies, I want to assign how much risk should be given to a particular company. This methodology now allows me to go and apply the same methodology that was used in financial context into this more OR context. Eisenberg and Noe have a contagion model, which had to do not with this particular model became very famous because they were looking at the asset allocation or obligations within an asset network. And again, in the interest of time, I want not go into details, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Basically, once you have this way of writing an aggregation function as an optimization problem, by using duality, we can get all the kinds of properties that we need. We need monotonicity, we need convexity. We can get that by just properties of the convex optimization problem that is connected with that aggregation function. Now comes the dual representation. Once we have rho as a convex risk measure, I can write its dual. Once I have dual prices, that should tell me that there is a way of allocating risk to the various companies. And what you can show is that for every firm I and for every scenario omega, there exists a dual value. You basically take their outcomes Xi omega, multiply them by their corresponding prices Ci omega, sum them across omega, and that is going to be the risk. That's what I'm going to call Y star I. Fine. This is great. But then the question to ask yourself is that how does this dual value matter? Because in some ways, what is the minimal quantity that we want? We want to understand that these are incentive compatible. So we have a theorem which is called the no undercut property. And the way I want you to think about this is the following. On this side, I have changed the outcomes. For different firms, I have put different alphas. So alpha 1 through alpha f, these are numbers between 0 and 1, or actually it could be non-negative. But the way I want you to think about these alphas in order to understand this theorem, assume that these alphas are either 0 or 1. That's it. The theorem is valid for any non-negative alpha, but think of them as 0 or 1. So all the companies for which the alphas is equal to 1 are agreeing to become a coalition. And when they become a coalition, the total risk that they generate is just given by rho with all of those. Because the alphas with 0 have just disappeared. They're not going to impact anything. So this is the total risk. Alpha y star is the total risk that my scheme is allocating to these companies. Again, think of alpha as 0, 1. I'm only taking the y star I corresponding to the firms that exist in that coalition. And this is the total risk I will allocate to them. This is the total risk they will independently generate by themselves. What this theorem says is by staying in my coalition, they're better off. I'm allocating to them less risk than what they would have done by themselves. As a result, the grand coalition is stable and we want to be there. Yes?
So, where does lambda play a role in that correlation?
Which lambda?
I mean, the aggregation function.
It's buried in here.
This is for a particular type of lambda.
Yes. So the way to think about this one is that either I can choose. Let me go back. Okay. One way to think about it is that I can choose this lambda and this rho 0. These are two ingredients that I take. The other possibility is to say, I don't want to do it that way. I will generate acceptance sets. So A star is the corresponding acceptance set for rho 0. And B star is the corresponding acceptance set for lambda.
So this is going to be related directly to like the conjugate of lambda.
Exactly. They're exact, and the stars were in the paper. The star basically represent the fact that it's a conjugate of a particular set that we generate from a particular level set generated from rho 0 and from lambda. So the lambda is buried in B star and the rho 0 is buried in A star. All right, so these are certain generalizations that was done by Auburn and Shapley, Dino, and whatnot. So it captures a bunch of different things. And let's go back to this story. So there are three firms. I'm going to use a CFAR and as the risk aggregation function and lambda total, which is just taking the total losses. And it turns out that firm 1 gets the total loss in the economy is 30. Firm 1 gets 20 over 3, firm 2 gets 20 over 3, and firm 3 gets 50 over 3. Does that make sense? Just eyeballing it. That firm 3 is actually the bad guy in this particular case. And that's because basically whenever the largest loss of 50 happens, it's accompanied by a very good profit. But whenever the largest loss of firm 3 happens, it's accompanied by losses here as well. So there's a correlation, which means that this guy happens to have its loss in just the right scenario where everybody else is having losses. And as a result, it ends up getting the lion's share of the allocation. We can expand things. We look at positively homogeneous preference consistent not convex risk measures. You can do monotone convex preference consistent not positively homogeneous risk functions. All of these things ends up doing, and in fact, you can play around with various things. The critical component is preference consistency. Once you have preference consistency, you can throw out many things and still work. The other part is we did the easy thing of just looking at finite scenarios, finite setup. There are a bunch of extensions that was done. They went into coherent systemic risk measures, convex systemic risk measures. These were all done in general probability space. More generally, it was done via more general risk measures where you don't have a point, but you have a set. And here there was set valued measures of systemic risk was also done. So there are many different ways that this initial theory that we generated has been extended. We have not been part of this. We're just merely bystanders looking at it. From our perspective, we were more concerned making sure that we understand it in a finite scenario, and then let more powerful mathematicians do their trick. All right. Now what I want to do is give you about, what, 15 minutes? Okay. I want to give you two more stories. They're going to be becoming more and more engineering-like as we go along. So what I want to go is look into asset firm networks. So XF, in this particular network, I only had firms. Assets were gone. And the reason assets were gone was because people were not changing their portfolio in any way. And when portfolios are not being changed, I might as well just say there is a particular loss associated with a particular scenario. I don't have to explicitly model for you what assets are doing in this scenario. The network just consists of firms, only captures cross-firm lending, defaults, haircuts, funding liquidity, everything is not there. But firms also interact via commonly held assets. Fire sales happen, mortgage-backed securities are there, volatility in the market, there's risk aversion. How can we model all of that? So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is a very stylized model. The final story that I want to get to here is, if I tell you that the economy is highly leveraged, what kind of an asset firm network would a regulator want? Which kind of networks are risky? On the other hand, if it turns out that the market is actually not very highly leveraged, do a completely different side of networks start making sense? So that's the answer to which I want to go in this piece. And there's going to be a lot of algebra along the way, but I'm going to try to at least keep the general picture in mind. Now what I'm going to do is, instead of saying that the portfolios are fixed, I'm going to say that each firms have a certain portfolio rules. And the rule that they are going to hold, the fraction of wealth of firm H invested into a particular asset I, is going to be determined by Q, which are the prices, and X, which are certain exogenous factors. It could also depend on the wealth, and in the paper, we allow for the possibility of W, X, and Q to be present. What do I mean by this? It means that basically, I want you to think of these firms as automated traders. They're getting X as an input, they're getting Q as an input, and they say, okay, I want this much position in different assets. This is not a bad approximation to either automated traders or situations where the asset managers have already discussed what the rules are going to be and they're just going to implement it. When you use a constant risk, relative risk aversion utility function with a risk aversion parameter beta H, it turns out that this particular pi has this nice structure. So X here is mu, sigma, and RF, and Q are the prices, and this is the formula that you end up getting. One criticism that you can make about this model is that when a crisis happens, people don't blindly go and apply these portfolio rules. They suddenly change. But we're going to make an assumption here that they will blindly apply these portfolio rules. And the idea behind this is to sort of understand that if they did apply these kinds of rules, what kind of bad things are going to happen. And we want to be able to understand before the crisis happens. But this is a problem. And in the last piece, if I get to it, I'll tell you how to remove that assumption as well. But the moment you remove the assumption, you become less general, more particular, because you need to know how are these people going to react in a crisis. All right. Market clearing would imply that W is the wealth, pi QX is the portfolio, D is the total number of assets. Maybe I have a definition. No, it's not there. D is the total number of shares outstanding. So the prices must equal D inverse pi QX W. Why do I care about showing you this expression? Q appears on both sides. So there is an equilibrium problem here. So once I give you these rules pi, they will induce an equilibrium in the market. And I want to understand how does that equilibrium affect the systemic risk in the market. Once you have this formula, the implicit function theorem tells you that there are two kinds of effects that are going to happen. There are going to be direct effects. That is, if X changes, theta 0, the initial endowment changes, the portfolio rules change, and that then gets multiplied by something that we are calling a network effect. Why is this network effect even coming? It's because of these two Qs that sit on both sides. If there was no Q sitting on this side, this amplifying factor is not going to be there. Implicitly, we are trying to capture this idea that I talked about right in the beginning of the talk. When I change my positions, it's going to change prices. When it changes prices, other people are going to change their portfolio rules, and that's going to impact me back. This blue piece is doing that. Red piece basically says that if external circumstances change, what happens to my portfolio? The blue piece says, by the way, even after you change, things are going to come back to you because of the prices. And this is essentially what we are after. These guys are kind of well behaved. If this fellow is badly behaved, bad things will happen. Why? Because it's identity minus something inverse. And that's almost a sign for things to be blowing up. Right? Okay. We're going to look at these two components. Again, I don't expect you to process this in real time. I want you to think about, I'm just going to give you the high level value for what is going on here. This is pi times theta. Basically, theta is the endowment normalized by the number of shares that are there. This is a holding induced cross asset interaction. It's basically how do different firms interact through the assets they are holding. H is a matrix that depends on the change in the portfolio rules as a function of price. We're going to assume that the portfolio rules are constant. This is not a bad approximation. This is something that asset management firms do all the time. So H goes off to 0, and I only care about that matrix. Yes?
Can the regulator do an intervention on that? Can the regulator change something to avoid the effect, or this is more like a passive way of looking out for what's happening?
Just hold that thought. The answer is partially. So what we're going to be looking at, I'm going to answer your question, but I can't quite answer it in this setting. I'm going to go to a little bit different setting, and then I'll answer your question. Okay. Essentially, what I'm going to do is that this inverse, now you can write it. The intent of this slide is basically to show that if you have something I minus some matrix inverse, you can write it as a series. So basically what is happening is that this is the direct effect, then one bounce, second bounce, third bounce, and so on. This is a typical thing that happens whenever you have an inverse of the matrix. Now, in the interest of answering the question that was raised, I'm going to start rethinking a little bit about this portfolio. I'm going to divide the portfolio up into two pieces. One is the leverage of the firm, which is basically how much money is it controlling relative to how much wealth it actually has. Most financial settings, at least in the time of the financial crisis, this leverage was about 3 times, meaning that for every dollar that they had, they were controlling 3 times the dollars. So if there's a 30% loss, they're going to be wiped out. And there were greedy companies that were going to go up to 6 times the leverage, which meant that if there was just a 16% loss, 14% loss, they'll be wiped out. So this quantity is going to play an important role. XIH is now just a fraction of the invested in asset I, so the portfolio now becomes a leverage times X. I'm going to call some economies feasible where the market clearing holds. And what I'm after, and in the interest of time and interest of getting to the punchline, I'm going to say that if things are in equilibrium, then basically B and X, these two quantities, the leverage and the network, ends up defining what is going to happen. And what we are after is to try to understand by how much things can blow up, which is the same thing as finding the spectral radius of this matrix I minus YX. X is the network, B is the leverage that's buried in here. I want to look at the spectral radius of this matrix. If the spectral radius of this matrix is larger than 1, bad things are going to happen. So I want to minimize this spectral radius as much as possible. So the network design problem that I have is look at all possible networks X and that minimize this blow up. Right? Okay. So we're going to look at 2 kinds of economies. One in which the minimum value of the maximum value is less than 1. Another where the maximum of the minimum value is greater than 1. Both of these are convex optimization problems. This is what I'm going to call a low leverage economy, and this is what I'm going to call a high leverage economy. Okay? Notice that these numbers, lambda max and lambda min, or lambda max under bar and lambda min over bar, can be computed by just looking at leverage. I don't really care about X because I'm maximizing over that. So the quantity of relevance is the leverage. If I know the leverage, I can detect whether it's a low leverage economy or a high leverage economy. So as a regulator, I'm starting to move towards trying to have some way of understanding this economy. Give me your leverage. I will first decide whether you're here or there. And then I'm going to say something more intelligent about it. So this is just a sanity check exercise that low leverage and high leverage economies are distinct. One of the big problem is that there is something in between, meaning that there are economies that are neither low leverage nor high leverage. So I don't know what to say about them. In these two ends, I can say something. So if the economy is a low leverage economy, then I should encourage my firms to become mutual funds. I should basically tell everybody, look, nicely spread out your money over all possible assets, because in the low leverage economy, shocks are actually buffered. If something bad happens to a firm, the leverage is low enough that the transmission doesn't happen very strongly, and these losses are buffered. If you're in a high leverage economy, I'm going to advise my firms that if I want to manage my risk, you invest in disjoint set of assets. The leverage is so high that I can't buffer losses. So the only thing that I can do is minimize the impact on the economy. So if your firm belongs to this particular group and something bad happens, you die. But all the other firms that didn't belong to this group, they're safe. So I don't want a connected economy. The picture that I was showing you before, where all firms were connected through the assets, bad idea if the leverage is high, but good idea if the leverage is low. So the punchline that we got out of this research was that leverage tells you what to do. And so that's a partial answer to what you were asking. I can't tell you what is the details of the network, but I can give you a very gross level understanding of how you should be behaving. So that's the second piece that I wanted to talk about. And I probably won't have the time to talk about the third piece in detail, but I'll give you a flavor for what it is. And this is a very different approach compared to the first two. The first two were much more, I would call, in the operations research side of the story. The last piece is actually driven by colleagues who work in chemical engineering. So in chemical engineering, there is this idea of process control, where they're trying to understand how to control a process. And the way the structure that they use to control the process is something called signed directed graphs. So signed directed graphs use the process engineering literature. It extends the analysis of arcs to loops or non-local interactions. And basically, the edges, instead of having a real number, only have a positive or negative sign. So the sign tell you what's going to happen. And the idea behind using this structure was the fact that a financial entity is more like a processing plant. So that was the intuition that we were looking at. It doesn't. So the first two ways of looking at it, we thought of it as graphs with flows happening. And in flows, what happens is stuff goes in. Perhaps it gets diluted, perhaps it gets concentrated, but the same kind of stuff comes out. And here I'm thinking about gains and losses. But in a financial entity, some stuff comes in, gets processed into something else, then comes out. Particularly duration. For those of you who are working in financial engineering, duration in matching or duration changing is something that is done routinely. Firms borrow money short term, invest long term. So they are trying to do this arbitrage between these two kinds of borrowing. And the intuition is that graphs are good for flows, but signed digraphs are good for flow transformations. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. All right. Here, now don't ask me too many questions over here, because my knowledge about continuous stirred reactors are pretty bad. So this was an intuition. This was an example that my chemical engineering colleagues gave. It's basically a reaction that is happening. It's an exothermal reaction, meaning that it generates heat. And that heat, at higher temperature, this reaction actually goes faster. So here's the picture, the sign digraph picture. Solid arc is a positive gradient, so it's a positive number. Negative arc are negative gradients. So when you increase the concentration outside of a particular entity, the concentration inside increases. When you increase the concentration of that particular reactant, the reaction rate goes up. When you increase the reaction rate, the temperature goes up, because This is an exothermal reaction. It generates heat. And so that particular picture has now been converted into this graph. This graph is special. It's not a, it's different in the sense that it has gains and losses, but the gains and losses just have a plus sign or a negative sign. It doesn't have a number associated with it. And so what you can do in these particular graphs is look for negative or positive feedback cycles. So there's a positive feedback cycle here, temperature to reaction rate to temperature. If by some chance the reaction rate goes up, it increases temperature, that increases the reaction rate, and this particular reaction will just blow up. So you need some kind of a control strategy to bring it back. And that's what this rest of the control strategy is doing. There is if temperature goes up, error grows up, the control gets kicked in, which brings the temperature back. This is the negative feedback that's going on, which is down here, which makes sure that this positive cycle is discounted for. All right. So where did we go with this story? What we did was that we took a bank dealer network, and a bank dealer network looks like this. There's a prime broker that basically trades in stocks and shares. A hedge fund is a client of this particular prime broker. Within the bank, there's a finance desk, so they can start buying and selling on their own. There's also a trading desk. So this is the particular desk that gives the cash. This is a trading desk that keeps track of how to trade in the particular market. And they also sometimes allow the hedge fund to borrow assets from them. Okay, so this is, in the interest of time, I won't get too much into what's going on here, but this is a simplified model of what a broker dealer does. And then what we did was we created a sign diagram out of them. Again, it's in the paper. I don't expect you to be able to look at this graph and say, hey, I understand everything. But what we ended up getting out of this was that we can start identifying positive feedback cycle. In that particular graph, fire sales is represented by a particular positive feedback cycle. Funding runs are also particular feedback cycles that you can get out of there. So once you have the sign diagram, you can start understanding what to do. And going back to the question about, okay, so you have this, what can that help you? Once you have the positive cycles, you can start understanding whether there is a way that you can put techniques by which you can introduce other edges to try to kill the negative, to kill the positive feedback cycle and introduce negative edges in there. And that was basically what we ended up doing. We have a technique for doing fast depth first search algorithm for discovering these positive cycles. We find that when we do these positives, when we analyze these positive cycles, they correspond to particular kinds of modes by which these particular systems can fail. And once you get to understand what those modes are, we can try to do some intervention. And I'm just going to stop right here. Thank you so much for your attention.